In this video, I want to talk about text selection. So this is a text editor. It's called Watt. I've been working on it for the past 10 months. This is in a series of videos talking about Watt and the interesting things I've learned while making it. If you want to start from the beginning, this is part of a playlist where you can go back to the beginning and get a bigger introduction or more general overview. This is the second video in the series. So text selection is really interesting. Watt currently only supports a single selection. Obviously, you want multiple selections in a programmer's text editor. I don't have that right now. I'll get to it eventually. But there's a lot to talk about even in single selection. So first thing you can do, you can click and drag to select text. If you double click and drag, you're selecting words. And if you triple click and drag, you're selecting paragraphs. And we also have auto scrolling, which means when you drag off the out of the window, technically it's out of the text view or out of the scroll view. You want the scroll view to start scrolling, and you want it to scroll proportionally to the size of to the distance you are away from the boundary of the view or of the scroll view. And I'm quite pleased with this. The sort of system AppKit provides a standard auto scroll method that allows you to do this, but it is relatively jumpy. And in fact, you know what? We can probably do this if we open this same file. Well, let's go back to a list and open this same file in TextEdit. There we go. And if you watch the auto scroll, you should see that it's pretty jumpy, and you can see that especially when you get close to the edge. And on the other hand, Watts will do 60 frames a second, and in theory it'll do 120. But I wasn't able to get the system to let me do 120. I'm not yet sure why. It won't do 120 on this screen, but my laptop screen should be able to do 120. Perhaps I'll do a more detailed video on scrolling at some point, but this is a place where scrolling overlaps with selection. So we can select with the mouse. You can click and drag and extend the selection. You can auto scroll. You can double click and select words. You can triple click and select lines. Pretty standard stuff. You can also navigate the selection with the keyboard. So I can hold down Shift and go to press the left arrow, and it goes to the left. And if I hold and then start pressing the right arrow with Shift, it goes to the right. And you'll notice, and this is probably a behavior that's familiar to you, one end of the selection is the anchor, and the other end of the selection is the head. So the anchor is this point, and the head is this point. And when you move the selection, you're moving the head, and the anchor stays fixed. And so at some point, the head is now to the left of the anchor, and if you go to the right enough, the head is to the right of the anchor. You can also go down and up. And one other thing that's interesting about selections in general is there's this idea of selection affinity. So let's say we have a caret here, which is just an empty selection, and we're moving to the right. Eventually, there's going to be a space here. And in fact, we don't even, well, you do see the space. You see the space in the sense of right here, we're just to the right of the O, which is to the left of the space. The space is in front of us. And then if I go to the right, the next location is after the space. What's interesting, though, is I can click over here and I can be to the right of the space. And this is, in fact, in exactly the same place as this selection. And so this is the first bit. This is called selection affinity. It, for the most part, only happens when you're at the end of a wrapped line. There's actually, Robert Lord wrote a great article about this called Text Editing Hates You, I think, that I'll put a link in the video description. But here is, already you're seeing, okay, there's a little more complexity going on in text selection than you might think. Here's another one. When you go up and down, moving a selection vertically actually requires layout information. You need to be able to compute the really, well, what you have to do is you have to say, okay, I want the caret to appear in approximately the same horizontal location on one line up, or one line fragment, one visual line up. And so what you need to do is you need to be able to calculate what is the position in the text corresponding to one visual line up, uh, and at the same x offset. Yeah, x offset. So when we go up, we're doing that. And in fact, another interesting thing, let's say we start here. No, that's not the right place to start. Let's say we start here. Okay, when I go down, because there's nothing on this line, it can't get all the way to the x offset that we were at. So it goes to the beginning. But when I press down again, you'll notice it jumps to the x offset that we were originally at. And so the caret actually has to remember its x offset uh, past multiple movements. And you can start to see, okay, this gets interesting pretty quickly. Um, I think, when I started looking at text selection, I sort of thought that I was going to see something axiomatic, in the sense of I was expecting to see, a few simple behaviors that compose into something, um, that works and that feels natural, and basically where you get a whole bunch of emergent behaviors out of a small set of primitive behaviors. And text selection, I think, doesn't work like this at all. What I would describe text selection as instead is a bunch of specific special cases that, when put together, give you something that feels right. And this is not something that I've thought about a lot, or at least this is not an idea that I've been nearly as exposed to. I think oftentimes as a programmer, you're thinking in terms of, or at least if you're a certain persuasion of programmer, you're thinking in terms of mathy things and axioms and composable things, and that's really not what's going on here. And I think that's pretty interesting. The other thing that's interesting, before I start showing some of this stuff, is basically every text editor does something a little different. Um, and there are all sorts of different, and they all kind of feel right, and you all kind of understand them all. But once you start looking, you realize, actually, there's a lot of diversity here. And I haven't even looked at text editors for other operating systems. I haven't looked at Windows much, and I haven't looked at any of the sort of major Linux toolkits. The other thing, obviously, there are Mac specific things here, like the right, there it is. It went to the bottom over here. So Control A and control, like, basically, in general, the Mac supports um, Emacs shortcuts. So Control A and Control E to go to the beginning of the line, or Control K to cut to the end of the line. Not every operating system, like I think Mac OS, as far as I know, well, actually, maybe some of the Linux UI toolkits do this also, but certainly Mac OS has this by default, and I added support for all of those movements into my text view too. And of course, so on different operating systems, these will behave differently. But even on just editors that run on the Mac, both sort of Mac native editors and then cross-platform editors, there is a wide variety of behavior. And yet everything sort of feels like it all works together. So let's look at some interesting non-axiomatic behavior. So we were before, I was holding shift and going to the right and the left, and obviously the head moves, and the anchor stays in place. Now we can also do that with word selection. So if you hold down Option and Shift and go to the right and the left, we're selecting words, and you'll notice there's another interesting behavior. Whenever is only partially selected, and when there's a point, just like when I'm selecting by character, if I go to the right from here, I'm in the middle of a word, and if I go, or I have, not that I'm in the middle of a word, I have a single selection, or a caret rather, where the anchor was, and now I go to the left and the right. And so this is actually just the same behavior as moving by a single character, right? If when the selection gets to zero size, you get a caret. One interesting thing is if you're looking at what the word selection does, if I'm going to the right, it selects to the end of each word. Um, and how you define a word is also interesting. What do you do with punctuation here is an interesting question. When I select to the left, I'm going to the start of each word. I may have said start twice. When you're going to the right, you go to the end of each word. When you're going to the left, you go to the start of each word. Um, some behavior that you might want. Uh, I don't know, Dave's text editor. That's punctuation, but ideally you want it to be, considered part of a word, right? You don't want the if you start here and you go to you press Command Option right, you don't want it to end here. Consider this a word, and then the next boundary is here, and so you have to special case that, uh, and I have. One thing I haven't special cased is how about a number, right? Um, Something like this. Uh, that comma in this situation ought not to be a word boundary because I think you would like to consider this 1000 to be a word. Um, and in, but, let's see, there must be a comma in here, right? This comma is a word boundary. Um, and I haven't done that. And then, there are also, I think, context specific word boundaries that you might want. For instance, you may want to have if you're writing in a programming language that has camel case, and this has been a pet peeve of mine in like every text editor, but I kind of think that the word boundaries should be here and here and here. Because it's like if you're editing something and you want to change the name or change a word in the middle of a multi-word variable name. Now this is a little different because now we're not talking about selection, but I want to go to the right. If I just press Option right, I don't want to be here. I want to be here. So I should be able to go Option right again and end up here, and then Option delete, for instance, and just delete this. And so I think good behavior here is actually really hard to. It's complicated and you can define it in many different ways. I think the other thing that we can look at is like, well, what does TextEdit do here? So if we open this with TextEdit, perhaps we'll see something interesting. Perhaps we won't. I'm not sure. Certainly, okay, this is the same behavior. No, already we have different behavior, right? So when I'm going to the left, it actually expands to the beginning of the word. And so now growing is fully highlighted. I chose not to do this, partially because this is a weird thing to have, unless you actually started here and went to the left, to have this space selected is not something that just the space selected. Oh, is this? Oh my goodness. Are they doing something different? Let me see really quick. Do. Oh no, never mind. They're doing what I was doing. Ignore that. But you'll see TextEdit makes a slightly different decision, right? Which is to say, when I go back, or rather, I guess what's the way to describe this? I start going back. Here is the anchor between when and ever. And if I go back once, and then now in what, it would put a caret here, and in TextEdit, rather than going to a zero length selection, it swaps where the anchor is. The anchor now becomes here, and the head becomes here, and it expands. And you can see that if I then go back, the anchor is still here. Or the anchor is on the right before the eye. All right, so that's already one sort of difference in behavior. The other thing we wanted to test was hello, everyone's world, right? And what happens here? Correctly, we don't consider this apostrophe to be a word boundary. It's interesting. What about this? Well, it does make it a word boundary because, it wouldn't make sense for this to not be a word boundary, but you can start to see the sort of complicated logic in here. And how about, what does it do here? Look at that. TextEdit knows that a comma inside a number is not a word boundary. And in fact, the decimal point is not a word boundary either. And the sort of, if you really want to do this right, quote unquote, right, this is locale dependent. I think in some European countries, you write like this. So you swap the the commas become decimal points, and the decimal point becomes a comma. Uh, and well, so it's like the word boundary. What is a word boundary now depends on the locale, which is a whole other layer of complication. Um, all right, what's next? Actually, that's a question. Yeah, isn't that interesting? So here we are, we're in TextEdit. I think I do this in what we'll find out in a second. If I double click to set the selection granularity, oh no, never mind. That was nonsense. I was forget I said anything there. Maybe I'll cut that out. Maybe I won't. Okay, going back to what. So here we can already see. Let's revert this. Oh, I can't revert. That's annoying. Well, here, perhaps that's approximately what it was like, and I'll refer it with Git later. I use Moby Dick to test performance because it's a relatively large document. This is something I got from my friend Jesse Grosjean. So let's talk about something else, right? In here in TextEdit, or in Watt rather, I choose to not swap here's the anchor and here's the head. I choose not to swap the anchor and head when I go to the left from this point. I just end up with an empty selection, and the anchor always stays the same. What about going to the beginning and end of a visual line? So this is command left and command right, and of course you can hold down shift and select the line. So this is what TextEdit does. I will show you, and I decided to copy the behavior. Oh, whoops. Let's reopen that file, Moby Dick, drag it up here. So you notice, and I think this is basically true in all of the editors that I've seen, or at least all of the sort of Mac native editors I've seen. If you hold down Command Shift and go to the right, and then you hold down Command Shift and go to the left, it swaps the front and the back, or the anchor and the head rather. And this is kind of, it's the same behavior as what's going on in TextEdit when you do the moving by selecting by word. My sense is like the reason you do this is because it's nice to be able to select a whole line or a whole visual line just in two keystrokes, right? And so boom boom, and neither Watt nor TextEdit are fully consistent in their behavior, right? Because Watt, I don't swap the head and anchor in single character mode. I don't swap it in word mode, but I do in line mode. Whereas TextEdit does not swap it in word or in character mode. What swapping it in character mode would look like is at this point, now the anchor which was here would swap to here, and so when I went to the left, B and E would be selected. So anyway, TextEdit does not swap in the character mode. It does swap in the word mode, and it also does swap in the line mode. That was also interesting, right? I think that's a bug in TextEdit. I went to the left, I went to the right, and then I Command Shift right again. What happened there? I don't even know. Maybe it was right, left, right. Yeah, look at that. I think that's a bug with selection affinity. So I did Command Shift right, and then left, and then I did right again. And I ended up with an empty selection on the next visual line. That is very funny. I don't think Watt does that. I don't want it to do that. Yeah, it doesn't, right? So I have it right in this case, which is to say, once these movements to the start and the beginning of a visual line are bounded. So once I'm at the end, no matter how much I hit command and right arrow, I don't go further. And I think TextEdit is like this too. I'm hitting command and right, and it doesn't go further. And here it also doesn't go further. But once I go to the left and go to the right again, it goes further. And I think that's probably a bug to do with the combination of the swapping of the behavior where you swap the anchor and the head, and something to do with selection affinity, right? Where we can be both. There are two possible locations to draw a caret that's at the end of the line fragment because these locations are the same. Okay, back to Watt. you can, there are other things you can do, beginning, end of paragraph, that also swaps the what is it? Swaps the head and the anchor for the same reason. Well, I don't know if it's for, I don't know what the reason is. This is only my guess, but my guess is it's nice to be able to select the whole paragraph with two keystrokes, and so it does it. I think one thing that might be interesting is let's look at other editors and see what what if any difference in behavior they have. So let me see if I can pop open Moby Dick in a in Xcode, and we can see what Moby Dick does. Where is this? Okay, it is in the Watt folder. I do not see it in the Xcode sidebar, which is annoying. So very annoyingly, it seems that I lost about half of my video recording. I don't know why. I think it never was recorded. I bet I talked for 40 minutes rather than 20 minutes. But let's try to pick up where I left off, and I'll see if I can't capture most of it. So what we were doing, I think, is we're looking at Watt and seeing, okay, here we swap the beginning and the end. Text edit does the same thing. Yeah, it does. Text mate does not do the same thing. And the question was, what does Xcode do? And the answer is Xcode does the same thing, except Xcode doesn't do the same thing. And the reason is you'll notice there's a space between before and coffin. And one thing is in Xcode, you can't actually click to the right. You can select to the right, which is hilarious, but you can't click to the right. So Xcode does not, at least in some way, Xcode does not have the affinity bit in the same way that many other text editors do. So I can click to the right of this space, which is the same location as where this U is. And in fact, if I were to type here, you'll see it goes right before the U. And so Xcode doesn't have the ability to do that. So there is a space here, and it's possible to select the space. Well, it's possible to select the space if I double click here. It's weird. But you'll notice if I go to the right, and if I go to the right again, it selects the space. And so Xcode is doing something interesting here, where you go to the, like the end of the line is not quite the end of the line, but it will flip the anchor in the head. And in fact, even though it's flipped now, I go one more, and it flips again so that it extends the selection. The other interesting thing is Xcode will just keep going, but it will stop you at like, so in TextEdit and Watt, no matter how many times I hit right, I'm bound to the end of the line fragment. Whereas in Xcode, I can hit right and keep going line fragments, and then be bound to the end of the line. In fact, one of the behavior, just looking at Xcode, that would be useful to see is just when I'm going to the left, command left, it puts you at the beginning of the first. I mean, this is the behavior we were looking at where it did not select, like where you had to select again to get to the end of that space, to get to the white space. It's doing that at the beginning here, which is, I think, actually sort of what you want. If I say I would like to move left from here, how about I move left to where the code ends, or the code begins rather, and if I move left again, then it selects the rest. The leading white space is maybe a clearer way to put that. So yeah, Xcode goes down, but does, once I get to the end of the physical line, where there's a new line as the next character, will not let me continue forward. TextMate does bound me, but doesn't swap it does not extend the selection in both directions, so it does not swap anchor and head. Visual Studio Code does not swap anchor and head. But here's the real fun thing. VS Code behaves differently. You go to the right, and then you press right again. It does something similar to Xcode, but instead of moving to the next line fragment, visual line, it moves to the end of the line in one go, which I think is kind of slightly nicer behavior. I don't think I mentioned this yet because I don't think I had Visual Studio Code open when the previous video got cut off. But you can see that in Visual Studio Code, you have this nice thing where the caret is still shown even when the selection is not empty. And this caret is at the head of the selection. So you know where the head of the selection is. It kind of makes this piece of invisible state visible, which I think it's nice. And I'm pretty sure other text editors have copied this. Certainly, I think Zed does this. Okay, and then you can you control A and control E, at least on macOS. This is sort of Emacs key bindings. We'll go to the beginning of the line, and if you do Shift, it does that. And doing just like going to the beginning of the visual line, and the anchor and the head get swapped, going to the beginning and then the end of the physical line or the paragraph, whatever you want to call it, the anchor and the head get swapped. And I think who knows why this is. It feels to me like it's for the same reason. You might want to select a full visual line, uh, and being able to do it in two keystrokes is nice. And you might want to select a full paragraph, and being able to do that in two keystrokes is nice. And here we're bound to the end. You can't go further. Um, Bound to the end. You can't go further. Um, Here, bound to the end. You can't go further in the current line, but it doesn't swap the the head and the anchor, so this behavior is basically the same. Um, yeah, there's a little difference in behavior. Okay, I guess this we already saw before, but command left goes to the beginning of the visual line, then it goes to the beginning of the paragraph. I go right, it goes to the end of the visual line, and then it goes to the end of the paragraph. Um, all of this is just, it combines in weird ways, and some of it makes a lot of sense, and some of it does not. Um, there was boy, I wish I wish I knew what I had covered in the previous video, or the video that got deleted, because I do not remember. um, Regardless, here's the thing I think I didn't cover, but that I think is interesting. We were looking at movements by word, and there was this question of whether, for instance, this quote should be a word boundary, and here it is. um, right. Oh, oh, and I just crashed. What? Who knows why? I'm not going to find out why. I'm just going to run it again. Good luck getting this all right with no bugs. um, so here we go to the right. We go to the right again, um, and and we're moving right by word now, and you'll see that this is not considered this is considered a word boundary, right? Treat it kind of the same as white space, but if we put it in here, it's not considered a word boundary. So we already talked about that, I think. But the an interesting thing is selecting words is different from moving by word. Oh, whoops. So if I start selecting by words, I said this already, and I move to the right, I'm always moving to the end of a word. And if I move to the left, I'm always moving to the beginning of a word. Um, if I just hold down Option and move, oh, actually, is this going to be the same? Yeah, it is. I must have been thinking. I remember what I was thinking about. It's not that moving with Option versus selecting with Option has a different behavior. It actually has the same behavior. But the question is, what gets selected when you double click? Um, you want to be able to select the double click and select the white space. And so when you're moving to the right or left like this, what you're doing is you're moving to the end of words and the beginning of words. Uh, when you double click, you're selecting, um, here I'm selecting the space in between words. And so what we're really talking about is word boundaries, just like any boundary, versus like whether it's the beginning or the end. Here's another thing. These are all like, this is all considered white space for the purpose of moving. But if I double click, I'll only select one of them. And this is just copying the behavior of, I think, what TextEdit does, which is, whoops, I mean to do that, which is to say, it coalesces the spaces when you double click here. Um, it, okay, this behavior is the same, right? That we jump over a bunch of spaces. But and this behavior is the same, you double click on some space and it selects the whole thing. If we replace this with commas, I think it's the same behavior here. Yeah, we only select one of them. So this continues to be, all sorts of different differing behaviors. That's not what I wanted to do. I'll deal with that later. The last thing I was going to say, or that I said in the last video, maybe I'm missing some stuff, but oh yes, I remember. Okay, so the last this gets real fun. Um, the question is, what happens if no, maybe it's last saved. Oh, it's gone now. Oh well. I know what I'll do. I will revert that in my Git client. So let's do that. Discard local changes. Okay. So the last sort of interesting thing was what happens move when you move from a selection to a caret. And so here, and this behavior I think is the same in all editors. You go to the left and it moves you. It doesn't move the beginning, move to the left. It just moves you to the beginning. So the lower bound is between A and B, and it moves you to A and B. And in fact, it does not matter which is the head and which is the anchor. So this is to say whichever direction I select or I drag it out, it's the same when I go to the left. And when you go to the right, you always go to the end. And what about moving up and down? Well, here I went down from the head, or sorry, I went down from somewhere. I went down from this point, but I don't know if it's because it's the anchor, for instance, or if it's because it's the lower bound. But we can figure that out, right? If I go down, I'm going down from the left, and I'm going down from the left, which means I'm moving from the lower bound. If I move up, same thing. I'm moving from the lower bound in Watt. Okay, what about TextMate? If I go up, Visual Studio Code. I go up, I'm moving from the the left side, and we'll see what happens when I select in the other direction. Okay, so I'm moving from the lower bound. But here's something fun. When I go down, I'm moving from the upper bound. So Visual Studio Code always does it from the upper bound. Let's see what TextEdit does. We shall reopen Moby Dick. If I select from here, I move up. Okay, I've moved from the left side. We don't know if it's lower bound or upper bound, so we can select in the other direction, or if it's lower bound or anchor. Whoops. In the other direction. All right, so TextEdit is moving from the anchor. Here the anchor is on the left, and when I move up, it moves up from the anchor. Here, TextEdit, we're on the right, or the anchor's on the right, we're moving from the anchor. And you can find every behavior in every different editor. Here, if I move up, I move from the right. That was the head. If I move up here, it's from the head. So this is exactly the opposite of TextEdit, which is to say the anchor is here and the head is here. If I move up in TextEdit, I move from the anchor. And if I now select in the other direction where the anchor is here, and I move up, I move from the anchor. And really what we're saying is the X offset here, the X offset of the destination where we're going is computed. It's the same X offset from the anchor, or as the anchor. And so this behavior is just the opposite over here. So here in Visual Studio Code, we're always moving from the head. Here in yes, we're always moving from the head. Oh, whoops, what am I doing? Go up. Go up. Oh no, Visual Studio Code is different. Visual Studio Code depends on whether we're moving up or down. So here is the anchor and here is the head. If I press up, I move from the anchor. If I select in the other direction, okay, what's going on here? We're moving from the lower bound, not from the anchor or the head. This is different than TextMate, different than I thought. If I move down, we move from the upper bound, and we're selecting the X offset from the upper bound. Move up, we're selecting the X offset from the lower bound. What other editors do I have open? What is Xcode doing here? If I move up, that's from the anchor or the lower bound. I move up. Okay, so this is from the lower bound. And you'll notice that actually Xcode always moves from the lower bound. It does not matter if I'm moving up or down, and it does not matter which direction, where the anchor of the head is. We're always getting the X offset from the upper bound. And this is I don't know which is right. I don't or not. There is no right answer. I don't know which feels the rightest, feels the best. But this gets even wilder when you're talking about multi-line selection. It's like, okay, I'm going to press up. Where is this going? Right? And the answer is here. It goes above the first visual line in the selection, and it selects the x offset from the lower bound. And that does not, it's the same if I select in the other direction so that the head is here, selects the x offset from the lower bound, right? So do this same place. Now, how about moving down? Well, Xcode moves down from the last line of the selection. So when I press down, we're going to end up with a caret on this line, and it moves from the uh, from the it picks the x offset from the lower bound always. Um, and I think that's the behavior I copied. So you go up, you go down, it moves the x offset always from the lower bound. It doesn't matter which. Oh, what just happened there? Oh my gosh. Oh, this is text edit. I thought this was what? Yeah, so text edit does something different, right? It's moving from it's taking the x offset from the anchor always, but it's moving to the top. It's moving to the visual line above the first visual line in the selection. So which direction I select from gives a different x offset, but we always move above the selection. And going down is the same thing. Which direction I select from, first when I put the anchor here and I went down, the x offset was here. When I put the anchor here and I went down, the x offset was here. So here the x offset is always being taken from the anchor rather than, say, in Xcode or Watt, always being taken from the lower bound. And this is not all the behavior, right? If you see TextMate, I go up. Oh, whoops, that was wrong. I go up, and it moves up from the, what was that? Was that from the head? From the head? Yes, it moves up one line from the head, as opposed to moving up one line from the first selected line, first selected visual line. And if you move the head up here, uh, it does the same. Whoops. Right. Sorry. If you move the head up here and move up or down, it moves from the head always. I think this behavior is just worse. Um, and, Visual Studio Code, I think, has its own behavior. Really, what we're looking at is the combination of two different behaviors. It's the behavior we were talking about where does the x offset come from. Sometimes it comes from the lower bound always or the upper bound always. Sometimes it comes from the head always or the anchor always. Uh, and then, so that's one behavior. And the second behavior is when you have multi-lines. Like if I go down from a multi-line selection, or rather, if I go up from a multi-line selection with the head down here, do I end up here or do I end up on this visual line? And so it's these two things composing together. All right, I think this is plenty of text selection stuff. I think the thing to take away from this is it is complicated, it is hard, uh, and there are a million ways to do it. It's not axiomatic. Oh, right, that's one thing that's worth showing before we finish, which is for moving up and down from selections. I documented it, right? I went and tested each thing. Um, this is just where the x offset is picked from. And you can see I think all behaviors for this are represented. Uh, Always from the lower bound, always from the anchor, always from the head. Well, there's not always from the upper bound, but there is always from the lower bound when moving up and always from the upper bound when moving down. And I wouldn't be surprised if you can find even more different behaviors. And so, yeah, this is a sort of modifying and extending text selection is uh, a real rich area where there are tons of behaviors, and perhaps it's just made you smile to see the complexity of something that is totally, that has been sitting under your nose, or perhaps this is helpful if you have to implement something like this. But yeah, text selection is a real beast. Um, and that's all for now.